Welcome to today's webinar, 7 Trucking Regulations That Will Change Your World. I'm Jay Cohen with Heavy Duty Trucking Magazine. This webinar is being presented by PrePass. PrePass is the leading provider of weight station bypass service. PrePass is the only provider also offering technology choices with either a transponder, an app, or both, as well as electronic toll payments and management services, plus software for monitoring and improving fleet safety scores and toll spending. Online at prepass.com. I encourage you to ask questions during the webinar at any point. We will try to address them all at the end of the presentation. Simply type your question into the Q&A panel. If we do not get to your question, don't worry, you will be contacted by email with a response after the event. Our presenter today is Warren Hoemann, former Deputy Administrator at the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration from 2003 through 2006, and now a consultant for PrePass. Warren previously served as a Senior Vice President with the American Trucking Associations from 2006 through 2017. Before that, he held executive positions in government relations and law at the California Trucking Association, for a major trucking company, at a research institute, and in private practice representing trucking companies. Leading the conversation will be Evan Lockridge, Content Marketing Manager for PrePass and host of the PrePass podcast, Eyes on the Road. Before joining PrePass, he spent nearly 30 years as a journalist covering the trucking industry for various publications and websites, and was the host of the Lockridge Report on SiriusXM Satellite Radio's trucking channel. Now, here is Evan Lockridge.
Thank you very much, Jay. Well, Warren, you and I did a PrePass Eyes on the Road podcast back in December on trucking regulations that we could expect in 2022. What has changed since we recorded that podcast nearly 5 months ago?
Evan, very good to be with you. On our podcast back in December, we focused on the regulations the federal government had already listed in its unified regulatory agenda. The stuff that agencies like the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, FMCSA, and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, had officially said they'd be working on this year. The 7 regulations we will talk about today extend beyond 2022 to the next few years. And while some of these potential regulations have seen the official light of day, others are prognostications based on the environment all regulatory agencies live in. But all of these 7 will change the world of trucking.
All right, so we've got regulations lumped into 3 broad categories. The first, regulations affecting commercial motor vehicles, then regulations affecting commercial motor vehicle drivers, and lastly, regulations affecting motor carriers. Warren, to start with, how did you divide these into these 3 distinct groups?
Well, only by first impression, because as our viewers and anyone in trucking realizes, a major regulation, whether it's on equipment, on drivers, or on carriers, affects the entire business of trucking. Even if it's a regulation supported by everyone, every rule imposes costs at some level and requires time and attention for compliance. Well, those costs and that time and attention flow uphill to the trucking company, including owner-operators, and even to the company drivers to some extent. But the categories kind of help, our discussion and focus our attention.
All right, well, let's jump into them. And I see we have acronyms in our future.
Well, yes, AEB and ADAS. AEB means automatic emergency braking. ADAS, on the other hand, means advanced driver assistance systems. We'll go a little deeper than just these titles. Automatic emergency braking and advanced driver assistance systems are already available features on newer model trucks. Now, Congress recently has required NHTSA and FMCSA to open a rulemaking to mandate AEB, automatic emergency braking. We can expect a proposal on that yet this year. In the unified regulatory agenda, where the agencies list what they're going to be doing, NHTSA said it expected to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking on AEB this April, with FMCSA following it with a proposal regarding the maintenance of AEB systems on commercial motor vehicles. Well, they didn't quite make that timeline, but we're watching the Federal Register for those publications. ADAS, on the other hand, includes such features as adaptive cruise control, lane keeping assistance, blind spot warning, camera-based mirror systems, and many others. FMCSA and NHTSA have been joined by many trucking trade associations in promoting the voluntary adoption of ADAS. Why? Well, NHTSA says that 94% of all highway crashes are caused by human error. So if technology can reduce those errors, safety should improve. In the next 2 years or so, I predict that one or more of the ADAS technologies will likely be proposed as mandatory. Now, we're talking technology, and in our society, advances in technology are a given. We hear about them every day. But in trucking, new technologies raise several questions, and we can bear these in mind whether we're talking about AEB, ADS, or other regulations yet to come. First of all, who's driving the truck? Is it a human or a machine? We say this because the airline industry has experienced crashes where the pilot pays more attention to the dials and the gauges, that is, to the aircraft technology, and forgets to fly the plane. Will that happen in trucking? The question is, how much is too much technology? A second question, how close are we getting to autonomous vehicles? Of course, we've already seen them tested on the road, but is society ready for wholesale AV trucks? On that note, NHTSA has just published language changes to make its regulations more consistent with autonomous vehicle terminology, and has published a regulation on occupant protection in autonomous vehicles. NHTSA clearly is saying AV is coming. And the final group of questions we should be bearing in mind here, what is the price tag? The cost of new trucks, with the corresponding rise in the price of used truck, already impacts entry into our industry. Think also of the wages needed to attract highly skilled technicians to install, calibrate, and maintain this technology.
Well, your comment, Warren, on the price tag of technology reminds me that it's going to take more than just so-called chump change to purchase a new electric Tesla. But now, one trucking technology that may not be so expensive, and it's getting a lot of talk lately, generating a lot of trucker comments, is speed limiters.
Well, it's a familiar debate. FMCSA has just published a notice of intent to reopen the 2016 rulemaking on speed limiters. FMCSA aims to have what they call a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, that's a mouthful, ready for review and public comment by spring of next year, 2023. Now, speed limiters, of course, are already in use by many fleets in a form of speed governors set to control maximum truck speeds. The questions raised by many drivers, though, and we're seeing it today, is whether speed limiters that are mandated can be overridden in merging and passing situations, and whether the slower speed of trucks will cause road rage among motorists. Now, bear in mind that meanwhile, many highway designers and safety advocates are looking forward to the day when intelligent roads will talk to vehicles, cars and trucks alike, and vehicle speeds will automatically adjust to the new speed limits posted. And on that note, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, has just commented on the speed limiter rulemaking. NTSB says that trucks should be limited at the posted speeds, not just at a maximum speed. Well, if we're going to do all this technology, such as automatically adjusting to new speed limits, some people are saying, why not have a mandatory speed limiter that can be temporarily overridden in situations like merging and passing slower vehicles? But to be fair, one where the act of overriding the speed limiter would be accompanied by an annoying beep, like when you haven't buckled your seatbelt to discourage the continued higher speed. And any speed above that limiter limit would be automatically recorded for review by trucking management and perhaps by law enforcement. Well, let's go back to our questions though. Will that improve highway safety? Consider this. There will always be a mix of high-tech and low-tech vehicles on the road, operated by humans, some of them no-tech humans, who do not know how other vehicles and other drivers may react. A high-tech vehicle cannot read the intentions of another vehicle the way that human drivers make eye contact and communicate with each other with a wave of a hand. A case in point, Google tested an autonomous vehicle. Its computer was programmed to treat a four-way stop just like we were trained in driver's ed back in high school. Vehicles at the four-way stop have a right-of-way in the order they arrive, but in doubt, you defer to the driver on the right. Well, the Google car was also programmed to stop when it sensed another vehicle entering the intersection, and those two programming features created a real problem for this autonomous vehicle. Because it could not make eye contact with the human drivers in the other vehicles, the humans, uncertain what was going on, edged into the intersection. The Google car stopped and stopped again and stopped again and never made it through the four-way stop until everyone else was gone. Well, that's technology's problems, but on the other hand, those human drivers must be paying attention. With any technology, though, we're going to have a period of adjustment during which the safety benefits of the technology will not be fully realized because we have human drivers.
Well, let's look at another area, underride guards. And at least underride guards, Warren, are not a technology issue, right?
Well, not in the way we may commonly think. Truck trailers have rear underride guards already. And in the recent infrastructure bill, Congress directed that the strength standards for those be increased. At the same time, Congress mandated a study of side underride guards. In the next 2 years, we may see side underride guards proposed as mandatory, along with rear underride guards on straight trucks. Mandatory side underride guards already are causing some consternation among trailer manufacturers. How would side underride guards be built for, let's say, flatbed trailers, which are designed to flex under a load? What about tankers and other types of trailers that have pipes and valves underneath, and you have to have access? One manufacturer of side underride guards says its products only add 400 to 800 pounds. Still, adding the weight of side underride guards will effectively decrease the maximum payload on the truck combination and thereby harm fuel efficiency as well. Well, just a thought, and it's just mine. Perhaps regulators should look closely at a technology fix for underride. They should look at ignition interlock devices that can protect us all from the drunk and drugged motorists who are the cause of most underride accidents.
All right, Warren. So, what do you see coming down the road that will affect truck drivers?
Well, Evan, there actually may be some good news here. Detention and delay, as well as truck parking, are major concerns of truck drivers, and they have caught the attention of federal officials. But let's start with a regulation that may be unfamiliar. That's UID. UID means Universal Identifier Device. A UID is an electronic device capable of communicating via radio frequency a unique identification number assigned to a specific commercial motor vehicle. Roadside enforcement would query that device and identify the truck and trailer. In order to make it universal, the UID would be mandated for installation or attachment on all interstate CMVs. Commercial law enforcement trade associations have already urged FMCSA to make UIDs mandatory. While UIDs are promoted as a simple quote-unquote electronic license plate, the question arises what else may be transmitted in addition to the truck identification. Is a UID the gateway to what is called the Level 8 wireless roadside inspection, which is sought by many in the enforcement community? Would the UID device communicate with the truck's own electronics and report problems detected by sensors on the truck? Well, that would be kind of a wireless roadside inspection. Well, that's good so far, but would the data transmitted also include hours of service status from an ELD? Or perhaps routes traveled from the truck's data management system so law enforcement would know where that truck has been? Or perhaps it would report a speed violation that occurred sometime before the UID was queried. Putting on my old lawyer hat, traffic violations are generally enforceable only when they are viewed or recorded at the time they occurred. So whether a court would uphold, let's say, a speeding citation based on a UID query from something 12 miles down the road from where the speeding happened, it's open to question. But even if the personally identifiable information of the truck driver is protected, these types of situations could lead to a lot of due process questions in court.
Well, let's go back to the good news. Federal regulations of detention and delay at shipper and receiver facilities may be on the way, but it won't be simple from what I understand, Warren.
Well, that's right. First of all, the legislation which created FMCSA and its predecessor agency makes no mention of FMCSA regulating shippers and receivers. Brokers and freight forwarders were mentioned, but not shippers and receivers, so FMCSA does not have broad jurisdiction over them. Congress would have to give FMCSA that jurisdiction. Second, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, we all know as the FMCSRs, are generally not enforceable on private property. They're highway safety regulations, after all. And third, shippers will point out just how one late trucker causes a ripple effect on every other freight pickup and delivery window. And those shippers will say, quite logically, should I be held liable for hours of service problems of those truck drivers that had to wait? Having said that, Congress did carve out one area where FMCSA does have jurisdiction over shippers and receivers, and that is where those entities are coercing, forcing, or requiring truck drivers to violate their hours of service. In the next 2 years, FMCSA may expand that definition to include a pattern of hours of service violations linked to a shipper or receiver facility. A pattern that indicates coercion, force, or gross negligence by the shipper receiver is the underlying cause. Now, that would not be a case-by-case regulation with just one driver complaint, and it would not provide quick results. But I do see FMCSA conducting investigations into a fact pattern. Those facts? Truck driver ELD records. Just a reminder, you better have them in good shape if you're complaining about an hours of service violation. Just so we're very clear on this, the federal law against coercion of truck drivers to violate hours of service applies to the employer motor carrier as well. When truck drivers complain to FMCSA about being forced to drive too long or to skip their rest break, or maybe to use the quote-unquote personal conveyance mode to get a little closer to the next load when they're supposed to be officially off duty. That, by the way, personal conveyance is a major concern of law enforcement. When those driver complaints can cause FMCSA to initiate a compliance review of the carrier. So, yes, coercion may be an entry point for FMCSA to deal with detention and delay at shippers and receivers, but it can also trigger FMCSA action against the motor carriers themselves. But there was a second good area of good news, and that is truck parking. The infrastructure bill we mentioned, which recently passed, unfortunately did not designate dollars for truck parking, but truck parking does remain an eligible expenditure under many of the infrastructure categories. Major trucking trade associations have urged Secretary Buttigieg to promote truck parking as the states and localities spend those federal dollars. And indeed, building more truck parking is the long-term solution, but it takes time. In the near term, motor carriers are already engaging in self-help efforts to find truck parking. Carriers work with shippers and receivers and other property owners to secure parking that is convenient, safe, and legal. And customers, perhaps listening today, who use the PrePass app already receive alerts about available truck parking. Today, though, we're talking about regulations. Will there be a federal regulation require shippers, receivers, and other property owners to provide truck parking? No. FMCSA simply does not have the blanket power to determine how private property should be used. But remember, we just discussed a possible regulation on detention and delay with FMCSA investigations of shipper-receiver facilities. That could be made more palatable to shippers and receivers if that regulation had a carrot as well as a stick. Perhaps those shippers and receivers that offer truck parking at their facility could be exempted from possible hours of service investigations.
Okay, so we've got detention and delay, truck parking, and UID. As Meatloaf sang, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Well, we've talked about coming regulations on trucks and on truck drivers, Warren. That leaves regulations on motor carriers themselves.
Well, whatever of the 3 categories, whether it's on the equipment or on the drivers or on the carriers, there'll be more regulations than we have already commented on. But when it comes to major regulations that will change the world of trucking, the 7th of these 7 that we have discussed will hit the motor carriers hard. That will be a CSA reform. FMCSA's Compliance Safety Accountability Program, CSA, evaluates the safety fitness of motor carriers. And for years, the trucking industry has complained that the CSA's 7 basics, the behavior analysis and safety improvement categories, all 7 of them do not all address the likelihood of a truck-involved crash. Under congressional direction, the National Academy of Sciences recommended that FMCSA utilize item response theory, IRT, to make safety evaluations more statistically valid. Well, IRT is a data-intensive approach, and it called for carrier data that the trucking industry regarded as personal or proprietary. FMCSA, for example, wanted to know how your truck drivers were paid, or what types of loads carriers were handling, or who was really calling the shots between carriers and shippers out in the marketplace. And maybe that data fit the IRT approach, but the motor carriers, pretty much as a whole, said that's a little too much intrusion by the government. So their CSA reform has sat for nearly 2 years. My prediction is that CSA reform will be back on the FMCSA regulatory agenda. And so too will the intense data collection by FMCSA, but instead of the IRT approach of requiring motor carriers to provide that data, FMCSA will look more deeply at publicly available records, police reports, court documents, to screen carriers for further review. That approach will avoid the industry's argument against providing personal and proprietary data because, after all, public records are public. And, of course, public records include consumer complaints, trial lawyer filings, union statements, many of which may be contrary to trucking interests. But at the same time as FMCSA looks for those records, it will state it welcomes the voluntary submission of IRT-type data, the data that motor carriers have said is too intrusive, but they can voluntarily submit it to FMCSA. Well, to give this approach some extra emphasis, FMCSA will once again open all CSA scores to public scrutiny. CSA reform will retreat from this idea of pure statistical validity and will use public opinion to leverage motor carrier statistical data and motor carrier compliance. Now, some may say this is a social media approach to safety evaluation. FMCSA will rest its case on public records, noting that motor carriers have an open door toward building their own case through the voluntary submission of the very same data FMCSA cannot compel.
Well, all right. Well, that is quite a list, Warren. So let's review the 7 trucking regulations that will change motor carriers' worlds, and that is number 1, AEB, ADAS. Then you have speed limiters, underride guards, UID, detention and delay, truck parking, and lastly, as you just mentioned here, CSA reform. Warren, what is your forecast that all 7 of these will become law?
Evan, you quoted Meatloaf saying 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Well, I can cite Bob Dylan. He said, you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. And the wind is definitely blowing toward more regulations. Now, much will depend upon the economic state of the nation. Will we enter another supply chain crisis? Will we still be dealing with high inflation? And as always in Washington, D.C., politics and the results of the coming midterm elections will help determine the fate of new regulations. Having said that, here is Warren's fearless weather forecast.
Let's have it.
All right. Automatic emergency braking, 100%. Advanced driver assistance systems, 85% likely for adaptive cruise control and 70% for blind spot warning. Adaptive cruise control will be voluntarily chosen by many motor carriers, but federal regulators will want to tie it in with NHTSA and FMCSA automatic emergency braking regulation and with FMCSA's move towards speed limiters. Blind spot warning, when it's available, will also be voluntarily chosen by carriers, but it will require federal research to fully implement whether cameras or radar works better and how far back blind spot warnings can and should be triggered for highway safety. Okay, speed limiters. Yes, we will have speed limiters. First of all, speeding is a major problem on our roads by all types of vehicles. I forecast that at 90%, now that FMCSA has published the rulemaking, there will be and already has been immense resistance from many parts of the trucking industry. If FMCSA chooses the path I suggest where a speed limiter could be temporarily overridden, and if speed limiters are mandated on new trucks only, so you don't have the retrofit cost on the older trucks, that 90% figure may go higher. Underride guards. Side underride guards are a very low 15% if retrofit required on all trailers, but a robust 70% for newly manufactured trailers. Why will we see side underride guards? Because it's so easy to blame trucks for underride accidents with the visual image of cars crushed underneath. There will be, I predict, some exemptions for certain trailer types. But alas, I do not see a federal regulation in the near future for ignition interlock for other mandatory devices on cars to guard against drunk and drugged motorists. That will continue on an individual case-by-case basis through court action. UID, Universal Identification Device. Trucking and commercial vehicle law enforcement must have a heart-to-heart discussion on what data will be accessible via UID and how it will be used. 30 years ago, a similar discussion found agreement in the electronic weigh station bypass program, now called PrePass. An agreement now over UID would give a mandate for UID, I would say an 85% chance of installation on new trucks and somewhat less for attachment on existing CMVs. But first, there has to be a talk. Detention and delay. Will we see FMCSA investigations into patterns of hours of service complaints about shipper-receiver facilities? I put that at 75%. Will that be an actual investigatory regulation? I put that about 65% because of resistance from the business community and the legal limitations we discussed about FMCSA. However, as we said, if there's that carrot dangled for truck parking, if shippers and receivers are absolved from hours of service investigations when they provide truck parking, a combined detention and delay and truck parking regulation is 70% likely. Of course, the devil will be in the details, how much truck parking and for how long. And then finally on the list, CSA reform. Face it, we already live in a social media world. FMCSA doesn't need a new regulation to begin using public records to guide its safety evaluations. That could be done as a matter of thorough investigation, and I'm sure that trial lawyers will provide everything FMCSA may desire. On the other hand, FMCSA will need to act formally to reopen all CSA scores to public view. I put that at 80%. But what I place at a full 100% is the need for trucking companies to tell their safety story before FMCSA ever goes down the social media road.
All right, Warren. Well, thank you very much for that analysis. Now, for our audience, if you have any questions for Warren, please submit them now by typing them in the questions panel. We will try to get to all of your questions before this hour is up. Now, in the meantime, it is one thing to prognosticate about the future, but it's quite another to keep you informed and ready to respond when regulatory proposals appear in the Federal Register. So where should you look? Well, right here at the PrePass website, prepass.com. The PrePass website offers articles, white papers, podcasts, recorded webinars, and even a monthly newsletter to keep your trucking operations safe and in compliance. Once again, go to prepass.com. All right, let's get to your questions. First one I've got here, Warren. Several of the possible regulations you discussed, such as the ones on speed limiter, detention and delay, truck parking, and CSA reform, seem a bit creative, to say the least. Do you really think FMCSA will come up with ideas like these?
Well, Evan, there are creative folks at FMCSA if they're allowed to think freely. Here's a lesson I learned while I was there. The administrator and I were trying to balance the costs and benefits of the hours of service rule revisions that were being contemplated at the time. We went to our FMCSA attorneys and asked, can we do this? They said no. Well, can we do this instead? No. It was then we realized we were asking the wrong question. We went back to the same attorneys and said, how can we do this? And they came up with a lot of creative ideas. So I wouldn't put it past FMCSA staff, if they're allowed to think out of the box, to find a lot of things out of that box.
Okay, our next question from attendee. Do you believe that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration will finally approve the use of cameras in place of side mirrors?
We've already seen, Evan, a lot of movement in that direction, and it has been allowed on an exemption basis, case by case. I believe that NHTSA will establish some parameters that if the camera-based mirrors meet, will be allowed, will not be mandated that you use cameras, but if you choose, they will be allowed if they meet those parameters.
Okay, another question we've got here. Someone is wanting to know, is there a way for the general public in this trade to fight these regulations, like the speed limiters? They write, because if they're going to limit speeds in the commercial motor vehicle, then why not cars that they say causes the most accidents for truck drivers?
And I think they are entirely right that motorists are the ones who are most at fault when there is a car-truck accident. Research done by DOT, done by the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety, which of course represents motorists, have come to that conclusion. NHTSA is the one that proposes new regulations on all new vehicles, all new vehicles, cars and trucks alike. So that would be coming from NHTSA. Do I see that coming on cars? I think it will be proposed in the near future. Trucks get the most attention right now. First of all, because trucks are the vehicle on the road that takes the longest to stop. Even a truck going at the safe, legal speed takes a long time to stop. So enforcement often looks at trucks first. Will it come on cars? I think it will. We just have not seen it proposed yet, and it has not appeared in the unified regulatory agenda under the NHTSA label.
All right. Someone else wants to know, is universal ID technology that you talked about earlier currently being used by either PrePass, EasyPass, or law enforcement?
Well, as I discussed about 30 years ago, the trucking industry and the law enforcement community came to an agreement that the superbly safe motor carriers should be allowed to voluntarily choose to be electronically identified by PrePass and by other similar programs, and then bypass way stations. This was a benefit to being safe for the motor carriers, and for the law enforcement folks. They knew then that they could focus their attention on carriers who are not so identified and may need further inspection. So, in a sense, we already have UID through the transponders and apps that PrePass and others offer. But again, that is a voluntary choice on those carriers who then also have to qualify through their safety record.
All right, another question here. Somebody writes that coercive complaints are on track to nearly double this year. Should we expect compliance reviews to double accordingly?
And that's a great question. One of the things that we've already seen from FMCSA, and it came during the pandemic when it was not in the health interest of FMCSA employees or motor carrier personnel to have an FMCSA official go out and do a compliance review on site. We have seen that FMCSA is moving toward more and more remote compliance reviews where they access the information from the carrier instead of going there to actually look at the paperwork or look at the carrier's own computers. The remote ability does allow for more compliance reviews to be done by FMCSA simply because you're not taking the time to send somebody to the carrier facility and then respond later. It can all be done electronically now and much more quickly. And yes, we should see compliance reviews go up accordingly.
All right, another question here. You talked a lot about regulations there, Warren, different ones. In your opinion, which one would be the earliest to be implemented?
Well, that's a good question. Obviously, automatic emergency braking is congressionally mandated, although NHTSA and it's also, as we said, already available in many newer model trucks. NHTSA and FMCSA have yet to come out with their proposals on that, but there really isn't any resistance to AEB in the trucking industry. I think following that, as we started this whole discussion, would be some form of advanced driver assistance systems that will work in concert with the automatic emergency braking. Those are the two I think we will see first.
All right, speaking of regulations, another question about one. If speed limiters are implemented, at what speeds will commercial motor vehicles be limited to?
And that's the $60,000 question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, went back in 2016 when FMCSA had the speed limiter rulemaking. It asked for comments on speeds at 60, 65, and 68 miles per hour. We've seen higher speeds out on our highway, legal speeds on our highways today. The American Trucking Association, one of the major trade associations in the trucking industry, says its policy will support 70 miles per hour if the truck is also equipped with automatic emergency braking and adaptive cruise control. So we have not yet seen from FMCSA what numbers will be proposed. That will come next spring when it actually comes out with its supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. But I expect that we will see a similar range of numbers capping out about 70 miles per hour.
Got a question here from a carrier that describes himself as an oversized, overweight provider, and they say that much of what you have discussed concerns them. What do you think all of these new regulations will mean for their type of company, and will there be exclusions for haulers in the oversized and overweight arena?
The folks who are in the oversized and overweight arena already have a lot of restrictions on them. They operate under special permits most of the time. Depending on the state, may have pilot cars ahead or behind the load. Um, they're only allowed on certain roads. They are, depending on the height of the load, they may be rerouted around certain bridges. They're in a very difficult world to live in already. Um, Obviously, speed limiters, you're talking generally about a type of truck combination that may not even be achieving the current legal speed limit. So a speed limiter will probably be just an added cost for that type of carrier because they probably won't hit that speed given the type of load they're hauling. Um, Whether similarly they will be required, depending on the type of trailer they utilize, whether they'll be required or exempted from side underride guards is a very good question too. Again, they may not be, if they're using a flatbed, as many oversized, overweight carriers are, those flatbed trailers flex under load, which makes it very difficult to have the side underride guard attached and level as is being proposed. Um, they're already living in a very difficult world. There's some more costs coming.
All right, got a question here, and somebody's want to know, is it safe to say that all possible equipment mods, I guess they're saying modifications here, like AEB and underride guards, will be required on all new vehicles only, or what?
And again, we're getting as to whether it's on newly manufactured vehicles or there will be a retrofit requirement. And generally, it'll be on newly manufactured equipment only. We have a lot of equipment out there, trailers in particular, in the trucking industry that have a good many years on them, and it is just not cost effective for a trucking company to add on new equipment, given that you may turn that trailer in, sell that truck in the near future. And those are very good arguments to raise when making comments to notice of proposed rulemakings. Uh, the folks who work at FMCSA or any of the regulatory agencies need to hear cost impacts. Even if you think overall regulation is good, they need to hear what it means in terms of costs, because as anybody listening knows, you need that money also to run your business, not just to achieve a certain level of safety.
We talked about a lot of different regulatory matters here. One we did not get into was hours of service changes, and somebody here wants to know, do you believe there will be any more changes to hours of service regulations?
Well, the last change of hours of service regulations that we had, which moved when you were mandated to take your 30-minute rest break, which made changes to short haul carriers on the total number of hours and miles they could travel. Those regulations are still being challenged in court. I think we're going to have to get through that litigation before we'll see whether FMCSA itself is willing to undertake further changes to hours of service. The other thing that will influence it, of course, is how rapidly the trucking industry adopts the advanced driver assistance systems. The more that FMCSA sees that technology is attending to some of the concerns over safety, such as following too close, such as going over speeds, such as lane changes without signals. More that FMCSA sees that technology in place, the more it may be willing to make adjustments on how long a driver can drive.
All right, going back to speed limiters, somebody notes that on newer trucks, the parameters of speed limiting can be adjusted on the engine control module with diagnostic software tools used by technicians. Do you believe this will be satisfactory when it comes to developing a speed limiter rule instead of installing an additional device?
I think a rule, of course, we have not seen the proposal yet. That's next spring. But I think the proposal will focus on what the engine control module or engine control unit, whatever you wish to call it, um, what it must, how it must be set, and if you have um, existing ability to set it within the parameters, uh, you will not need to add further further device onto the truck. The question will become, of course, is how do we know, other than seeing that a truck is exceeding a maximum speed, how do we know that the electronic control module has been appropriately set? I am sure that is one of the discussions when it occurs that law enforcement and trucking will have about the information that the UID transmits.
Okay. Back in your presentation, you suggested that one or more advanced driver assistance systems technologies will be proposed as mandatory. Which ones, Warren?
I believe. Well, we're already going to get be pause and get back to you on that one.
It's all right. If you want to think about
Yeah.
that, and we'll come back to it in just a minute. Let's see. Another question here. Do you believe that agricultural haulers are going to be subjected to speed limiters?
Yes. Yes, I think they will not make a differentiate between agricultural haulers. Of course, ag haulers have their own hours of service rules because they're carrying livestock in many instances. Um, but as to speed, they'll be subject to it just like everybody else. And as far as ADAS, and thank you for that opportunity to get back to my notes, I believe that we will see adaptive cruise control, which is already common on newer trucks, be the first one. And I expect blind spot warning to be the second advanced driver assistance system that we will see.
Okay, well, on that same topic of ADAS, you noted the price tag attached to new technology. That same point has been raised with government officials and others, along with the price tag of charging stations. Does an economic argument ever resonate with regulators when talking about these possible rules?
The answer is yes, but let me tell you a story to kind of illustrate that. I had the honor of serving on an advisory board of a university transportation research center. These very, very bright academicians there calculated the safety benefits, that is, the cost savings in terms of reduced liability and reduced damage, if motor carriers adopted certain advanced technologies. Well, a fellow advisor to that research center, who was a trucking executive, responded that his company had, in fact, already adopted those same advanced technologies on a portion of its fleet, and the cost savings were even greater than the academicians had calculated. Well, they just jumped up there. The researcher says, "Well, you put it on a portion of your fleet. Why didn't you install the technologies on your entire fleet?" Well, the trucking executives responded with a sigh. He says, "We have a limit on our capital expenditures. We don't have the money to do it all at once to meet our other needs and to keep the company running." So the point is, when you see a new technology proposed and you think, hey, it's great, it does work, it does improve safety, you still have to tell the regulators the realities of operating a company. You have to provide them some hard numbers, not just opinions, and an explanation why, yeah, I like that, I support it, but to do it immediately and wholesale across my entire fleet, including my trucks that are 10 years old and my trailers that are 20 years old, doesn't make economic sense. You have to put those in your comments being very specific, and it will
Okay.
work if you do.
All right. Another question here. Have you heard any talk about making it harder for drivers that have older trucks to get them registered or just to operate them in any form? For instance, now there have been some regulations in California that have prohibited older trucks, especially at the ports. Anything like that from the feds?
We don't see anything like that from the feds, but I do expect we'll see that. You mentioned California from certain states, particularly if it's tied into climate issues and the environment and the emissions from older trucks. The trucking industry has done a really, really good job on emission levels and continues to improve. But where older trucks are commonly used, like in ports, in heavy hauling, in ag situations, and used there because they don't run many miles, uh, those trucks tend to be older. And when it comes to registration, they may either be paying a little extra money to the state, or the state may take steps to say no more.
Get to another question here. Bear with me just a minute here because I'm trying to make sense of this. Okay. What about you were talking about the CSA reform there? Will CSA's crash indicator still list non-preventable crashes if a fleet data queues them?
Yes, um, the non-preventable crashes will still be there, but but uh, FMCSA will not consider them in the CSA calculations as long as they've been determined to be non-preventable. But factually, they do not disappear.
On the side underride guards, you mentioned that added weight will effectively decrease the maximum payload of truck combinations. Isn't it true that only a small percentage of trucks ever reach the federal maximum of 80,000 pounds?
Yep, that's correct. But even a greater percentage of trucks reach 78,000 or 79,000 pounds, whatever the effective maximum would be with the addition of the weight from the underride guards. Uh, but more to the point, and what needs to be stressed when you're talking to regulators, when you submit comments, is that the added weight in this case reduces the range of opportunities that a motor carrier has with that equipment. No business, whether it's trucking or any other business that has already invested in very expensive equipment, wants government regulation that says you cannot use it to its fullest extent.
Well, all right, our hour is up. Warren, my thanks to you for all the informative information, and thank you to all those attending from everyone at PrePass, and I will throw it back to Jay.
Okay, thank you. As you mentioned, that is all the time we have for today, but just want to remind people that anyone who did ask a question that was not answered, the PrePass team will be following up via email to answer your question individually. We hope that you all enjoyed today's webinar, and I want to again thank Warren Hoemann, Evan Lockridge, and PrePass for this presentation. I also want to mention that this webinar will be available on demand on the Heavy Duty Trucking website. That's at truckinginfo.com/webinars, as well as on the PrePass website in the resource library at prepass.com. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. Goodbye.